A 9-year-old girl took a brutal blow to protect a war dog. 24 hours later, an army of 200 canines stood guard at her hospital bed.
You see that mutt? Bet he can't even bark anymore. The voice rang out across the quiet street like a rusted bike chain yanked too hard, sharp, juvenile, and loud in the way only bored teenagers could be when they thought no one would challenge them. It came from the sidewalk outside McKinley's Mart, the town's aging gas station and after-school pit stop, where the air smelled of overused fryer oil and fading pavement chalk drawings still clung stubbornly to the curb. The sun hung low, golden and soft, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked asphalt like limbs reaching for something they'd long forgotten. The German shepherd didn't flinch. Neither did the man beside him, who sat stoically on a folding lawn chair pulled up next to a battered RV parked just past the fire lane. His camouflage cap shaded his weathered face, and though the name stitched above the brim, Morrison, was faded. The crease in his posture was military sharp. His eyes, hidden behind mirrored lenses, stayed on the horizon as if he hadn't heard the boys at all. But the dog, broad-shouldered, graying at the muzzle, his eyes watchful and quiet, shifted slightly, adjusting his weight like a soldier rebalancing under tension. "Probably so old he thinks it's still Nam," one of the boys added, snorting, his voice curling into mockery. Another laughed and tossed an empty sports drink bottle toward the RV, where it clinked once against the curb and rolled lazily to a stop near the shepherd's front paw. Inside the store, Sophie Wallace stood on her tiptoes, peering over the checkout counter to drop a pack of peanut butter crackers beside a dollar bill she'd folded twice and pressed flat in her pocket since morning. She had walked here like she always did after school, a 9-year-old with a backpack too big for her shoulders and a rhythm to her steps that sounded like curiosity more than routine. But when she heard the laughter outside, the wrong kind of laughter, the kind that made her ears burn before she understood why, she turned and looked through the glass door just as one of the boys pointed a stick at the shepherd like it was a target on a carnival wall. Her chest tightened. The old man outside, Mr. Hank, as she always called him, had never once asked anything from her, never even invited her closer. Yet for the past 4 months, he'd been her secret after-school ritual. Each time she crossed the street to sit beside the shepherd, to ask questions about his training, or to gently feed him pieces of apple slices wrapped in napkins from home, Hank would nod once and say, "He's retired now, but he still watches." Briggs, the shepherd, had let her braid a small pink ribbon behind his ear one afternoon. He hadn't moved the entire time. Sophie pushed open the door and stepped outside. She didn't yell. She didn't march up like some self-declared hero. She simply walked, straight, calm, focused, until she stood between the boys and the dog, her face turned upward, her voice clear without being loud. "Don't touch him." The tallest boy arched an eyebrow caught between surprise and amusement. "You serious? Your dog or something?" "He's a veteran's partner," Sophie replied. "He saved lives." One of them scoffed. "He's just a mutt. He's braver than you'll ever be." That cut deeper than any of them expected. The laughter faded, replaced by the awkward shuffle of kids unaccustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone half their size and twice their composure. But pride rarely backs down gracefully, and the moment stretched into something brittle. Then came the leash. A second boy, thicker in the shoulders, dragged forward a pit bull, wide-chested and wearing a collar that looked more like a weapon than an accessory. The dog was alert, its ears clipped, tail taut, eyes darting from Briggs to Sophie and back again, as if uncertain where the threat was supposed to be. "Let's see if your war dog can still stand," one boy muttered, loosening his grip. "No," Sophie said, stepping forward, her voice firm now, more command than plea. But the leash dropped. Briggs rose. There was no bark, no warning growl, only a shift in weight, a squaring of stance, and a gaze so direct it made even the pit bull pause. Hank stood too, slower than the shepherd, but just as deliberate, his hand reaching for the leash even as his knee buckled slightly. The boy lifted a piece of metal, A slim pipe, maybe an old tire iron, more bravado than weapon, but dangerous in the hands of someone with something to prove. And Sophie moved. She didn't think. She didn't call out. She stepped between the dog and the swing, her arms spread, body tight, heart pounding. The pipe hit before anyone could stop it. A sickening thud, flat and final, landed against her ribs and shoulder. She dropped like her legs had vanished beneath her, the impact flinging her small frame sideways across the sidewalk. Briggs lunged, not to attack, not to bite, but to shield, his body curling around hers, his massive frame now trembling with fury so deep it barely made sound. The boys ran. Of course they did. They ran like cowards always do when the damage has already been done, and the silence afterward is louder than any threat. Someone screamed. A passing jogger darted across the street. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, and blue lights began bouncing off storefront windows like judgment descending too late. But the video. Oh, the video had already started. A bystander had captured the entire thing on her phone. Sophie stepping in front of the shepherd, the swing of the pipe, the sound of her fall, and the way the dog covered her like a second skin. By the time paramedics loaded Sophie into the ambulance, the footage had already traveled faster than truth normally does. The caption read, "She didn't even hesitate to protect him." And with that, the world turned its gaze toward Wesley Ridge. Not because of the violence, not because of the dog, but because a little girl had chosen to stand between cruelty and innocence with nothing more than her body and belief that no one should ever face the fight alone. Hank remained behind, blood staining the cuffs of his shirt, his voice hoarse from calling her name, his hand never once leaving Briggs's shoulder as the shepherd whined so low it seemed to rattle the pavement. By nightfall, Sophie was in intensive care. By dawn, her name was trending in 15 states, and by hour 23, something was moving across the country, something four-legged, trained, disciplined, and loyal, heading not to retaliate, but to respond. The fluorescent lights of St. Anne's Regional Hospital flickered softly against the sterile walls of the ICU, casting long shadows that shifted with every footstep, though none seemed to reach the corner of the hallway where Hank Morrison sat, motionless in a molded plastic chair that had never been meant for waiting this long. The coffee cup balanced in his right hand had long since gone cold, untouched since the nurse had pressed it into his palm hours ago, her voice kind but distant, as if she had already learned that some kinds of grief couldn't be comforted with caffeine. Behind the double doors, Sophie Wallace remained silent. Machines whispered around her like ghosts, their blinking lights the only proof that her small body was still trying to fight, though it was unclear whether she even knew what she was fighting for. Tubes snaked across her chest and down her arms, and her face, normally animated by curiosity and mischief, had turned pale beneath the soft halo of her hospital blanket, which had been tucked in too neatly by hands that trembled slightly while pretending not to. Her mother sat beside her bed without moving, her knuckles white around a rosary she hadn't touched since her own mother died, while her father, summoned from a freight yard 2 towns over, paced in tight, angry circles just outside the curtain, his boots leaving scuff marks on the polished linoleum that the janitor would later leave untouched, as if the marks themselves were part of the story now. And yet, none of them noticed the man in the hallway. Not the way he leaned slightly forward, as if still bracing for the sound of a second blow. Not the way his right hand twitched every time someone said her name. Not the way he hadn't spoken a full sentence since she fell. They didn't see Briggs either. The German shepherd had refused to leave the hospital parking lot, his leash long since dropped, his body rooted beside the rusted bench outside the ER bay, where he lay curled with his eyes locked on the entrance like he was waiting for orders no one would give. Every hour, a different hospital employee passed by with hesitation in their step, some offering water, others attempting to coax him away with treats or softly spoken encouragement. But he remained unmoving, his gaze fixed, his posture stiff with expectation, as if leaving that spot would mean abandoning something he wasn't yet ready to lose. Animal control had come and gone. They'd issued a citation, filled out a form, and left with shrugs, citing that the dog presented no immediate danger, though one of them had later admitted, beneath his breath, that Briggs looked less like a threat and more like a soldier standing watch over a battlefield only he could see. No one knew the full story. No one but Hank. Years ago in Fallujah, there had been a convoy ambush, the kind that tore through armor and air alike, and Hank had come out of it with a busted shoulder, 2 ruptured discs, and a shepherd who had dragged him from burning metal even as bullets chewed through the dust around them. Briggs had been trained to take orders, to push forward when told, to hold when commanded. But somewhere between the war and the flight home, he had stopped being a weapon and started becoming something closer to Hank's conscience. The rest of Hank's unit never made it. Briggs did. And now, after surviving 2 wars and a decade of silence, the dog had found something, someone, who looked at him not as a tool, not as a leftover, but as a living, breathing piece of something worth loving. That someone now lay unconscious behind glass. And Briggs was unraveling in quiet, measured inches. Back in the ICU, the hallway had grown more crowded. Reporters had begun appearing at the far end, held back by hospital security who recognized the fine line between curiosity and intrusion, but were slowly losing control of the narrative. The video had gone viral sometime around 3:14 a.m., reaching 2 million views before breakfast and sparking hashtags that surged across timelines like wildfire through dry timber. Justice for Sophie. Just a stand with Briggs. 1 girl, 1 dog. None of them had been created by Hank, but each one felt like a thread pulling at something in his chest he didn't know how to name. He hadn't slept, had barely blinked. The only moment his posture had shifted was when Officer Riley Monroe arrived. Riley, who had once trained dogs like Briggs for the Army, and who now wore a badge because his knees wouldn't survive another tour, didn't approach with words. He simply sat beside Hank, hands resting on his thighs, and let the silence stretch between them until the noise of the world faded. She was the first person who ever called Briggs a gentle giant, Hank finally said, his voice dry as desert stone. Riley nodded. She never asked what war he fought in. Hank continued, his eyes still on the door. She just said he looked tired and offered him part of her sandwich. That sounds like her, Riley said. The pause after that wasn't empty. It was heavy with memory and decision. When Riley stood, he pulled a phone from his jacket and tapped through his contact list with a kind of precision that came not from urgency, but from a promise long held. Within minutes, he had made 6 calls, each to handlers, officers, and retired soldiers who had once worked with dogs like Briggs and girls like Sophie, and who didn't need an explanation once they saw the footage for themselves. By that evening, units from 4 surrounding counties had already committed to show up, not in protest, not for politics, but for Sophie and Briggs, and the idea that loyalty didn't belong to a uniform or a leash, but to a moment and a child and a dog who had never once turned away. Long before the sun burned the frost off the street signs of Wesley Ridge, the town had already begun to stir, not from alarm clocks or the buzz of morning traffic, but from the quiet sound of tires easing over gravel, of boots stepping lightly onto pavement, of doors closing softly behind silhouettes that didn't need to announce their presence to be known. They came before dawn, before the reporters arrived, before the hospital staff even realized something had begun to shift outside their walls. And when they came, silence. They did not bring banners or microphones. It began with a single police cruiser from neighboring Franklin County, and its lights off, engine idle, windows rolled down just enough for the shepherd in the passenger seat to scent the wind and prick his ears toward the ICU wing of St. Anne's Regional Hospital. The officer inside, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, wearing the patch of K9 Unit 42 on his sleeve, stepped out without speaking, opened the back door of the cruiser, and guided a second dog to the sidewalk with the kind of practiced ease that comes not from training, but from trust. He didn't look around. He didn't check his phone. He just walked forward, paused at the edge of the hospital lawn, and stood still. Then came another unit, then 6, then 24. By the time the sun finally rose high enough to spill gold across the southern wing of the hospital, the street out front had become something else entirely. A living corridor of uniforms, K-9 handlers, rescue teams, therapy dogs, retired combat pairs, and SAR units from as far as North Carolina and Delaware, all lined shoulder to shoulder in quiet formation, their dogs standing tall beside them, tails still, ears forward, eyes locked on the glass doors behind which Sophie Wallace still slept. There were no signs, no speeches, only motion. One by one, each handler approached the wooden crate placed beside the entrance, hand-carved overnight by a local carpenter who had seen the video and wanted to do something more permanent than a bouquet. Inside the box, already lined with folded ribbons and laminated patches, they placed tags engraved with the words, "For Sophie." Some were worn, others new, but all had once hung from a collar that served. And now they were here for a different kind of service. Not in war, not in disaster, but in solidarity. Hank stood just outside the hospital entrance, his cane planted firm in the concrete, his eyes rimmed with red, not from grief, but from something older, recognition. He had seen formations before, had stood in them himself, had buried brothers who never got to leave theirs. But this was different. These weren't soldiers called to arms. They were guardians summoned by instinct. Beside him, Briggs stood still. His coat had been brushed that morning by a veterinary nurse who said she didn't usually do that sort of thing but felt he needed it. His vest, once used only for protection, now bore the words Honor K-9 in navy thread, sewn in by someone who had stayed up all night stitching under a desk lamp. When Briggs saw the shepherd from Unit 17 approach, his tail moved once. Not in joy, in acknowledgement. A group from Texas arrived just before noon. 6 handlers, 6 dogs, 1 flag. It was the flag that brought Hank to his knees. Worn but carefully folded, it had once flown over a training facility where Sophie had, months earlier, mailed in a crayon-drawn letter thanking the handlers for keeping the world safe with brave dogs. She'd drawn a picture of Briggs on the back, her name signed in wide, careful letters. No one had known she sent it. No one had thought much of it, until that same letter, laminated and tucked inside a field pouch, was pulled from the uniform of a woman now standing with her arm across her chest, tears in her eyes, and her shepherd sitting perfectly still beside her boots. Briggs moved forward then, slowly but with purpose, until his nose touched the pouch. He did not bark. He did not whine. He just stayed there, unmoving, while the crowd fell even quieter, as if the very air understood it was bearing witness to something heavier than ceremony. Inside, the ICU staff had gathered behind the second-floor windows, peering through blinds that no longer concealed awe. One of the nurses had to excuse herself after realizing the baby monitor next to Sophie's bed was picking up faint sounds from outside. Not sirens or engines, but breathing. So much breathing, so many hearts. The media came, of course. Drones hovered, cameras rolled. But no one dared speak over what was happening, because the story was already telling itself without narration. And when the hospital administrator stepped outside to read a short statement, even he paused mid-sentence, unable to continue after seeing the sheer volume of presence. Not a protest, not a flash mob, not an orchestrated PR stunt, but a community of dogs and humans bound not by outrage, but by understanding. And then the doctor emerged. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because he understood the weight of what he was carrying, not in his hands, but in his voice. Hank turned, searching the man's eyes before he could speak. The doctor placed a hand gently on Hank's shoulder, his other gesturing behind him toward the hospital doors. "She's breathing on her own," he said, his voice steady but quiet enough that only those closest heard it first. "She moved her hand this morning when we said his name." The crowd didn't cheer. They exhaled. Not all at once, but in waves, like relief passed down a line of soldiers, like a storm finally breaking over a field that had waited too long for rain. Someone wept softly. Someone whispered a prayer. And someone, maybe Briggs, maybe the wind, let out a single low sound that felt less like noise and more like release. The march, as the news would call it later, wasn't about numbers, though there were hundreds. It wasn't about dogs, though there were more than anyone could count. It was about a child who stepped in front of cruelty, and the world that stepped forward behind her. The first thing Sophie heard was breathing. Steady, low, close enough that it felt like it belonged to someone curled up beside her bed. Someone large and quiet and unafraid to wait as long as it took. Then came the sound of a tail thumping softly against tile, followed by the faintest creak of a leather leash shifting in place. She didn't open her eyes yet. She wasn't ready, but she knew exactly who it was. Briggs. And somehow, that made the pain in her ribs feel smaller. When she did finally blink into the filtered light of the ICU, it wasn't bright overheads that greeted her, but the soft morning glow streaming through curtains, and the shape of her mother's head resting on the edge of the bed, arms crossed protectively over Sophie's stomach, body still wrapped in the clothes she'd been wearing for days. Her father sat nearby, one hand curled around a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, the other fidgeting with a paper bracelet the hospital had clipped to his wrist when he first arrived. But it was Hank who noticed her eyes open first. He had been sitting at the corner of the room, half in shadow, boots planted wide like he couldn't quite trust the ground beneath him, and when he stood, the sound of his cane striking linoleum startled everyone else awake. Briggs didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his tail swept again. Slow, deliberate, full of recognition. Sophie didn't say anything at first. Her throat felt like paper and her chest hurt when she breathed too deeply. But her eyes moved toward Briggs, and her fingers twitched in the direction of his paw. When the nurse finally stepped in and adjusted the bed, lifting her slightly so she could see the room better, her voice cracked out in a whisper so soft it almost didn't register. "Is he okay?" Her mother, caught between tears and relief, nodded too many times before she could answer. "He's right here, sweetheart. He's been here the whole time." Briggs stepped forward then, slowly, carefully, as if he understood the IV lines and the wires mattered, and lowered his head until it touched the side of Sophie's hand. She smiled for the first time in 4 days, the corners of her mouth twitching upward like sunlight breaking through frost. Her fingers curled weakly into the fur at the base of his ear. That was when the nurse pulled the curtain back, and Sophie saw what waited just outside her window. Dozens of laminated ID tags hung from the curtain rod, unit insignias, K-9 badges, state police credentials, all looped together on a makeshift garland that arched over the entire frame. Beyond that, the sidewalk was still packed, handlers in uniform and out, dogs lying at ease or standing at attention, tails swaying like wind chimes beneath steady hands. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was something else entirely. "They came for you," Hank said, his voice thick, quieter than usual. "They've been here since yesterday." Sophie tried to sit up further. She wanted to see all of it. She wanted to count every collar and every vest, to know which one belonged to the dog she had drawn in her notebooks or written letters to months before. Her mother adjusted her pillows, and the nurse helped raise the head of the bed, giving her the view she didn't know she'd been waiting for. And still, it didn't feel real. Not until a handler from the Texas K-9 division stepped forward, carrying something folded carefully beneath one arm. The woman paused just outside the glass and lifted the flag that Sophie had drawn and mailed half a year ago, the same one now laminated and framed in a shadow box, protected like a relic. Sophie covered her mouth, and her eyes flooded without sound. The room held its breath. The nurses at the door held back tears. And Briggs, still pressed against her hand, let out a low, contented breath, the kind of exhale a soldier makes when he finally knows the fight is over. Later that evening, the story would make it to primetime television. Not just a segment, the whole lead. Sophie Wallace, 9, had thrown herself in front of a dog trained for war, and in doing so, had started something no one saw coming. News anchors choked up while reading her name. The footage from the march played behind studio desks as experts in uniforms and suits tried to explain why the story mattered so much, but none of them said it better than a Marine sergeant from Arizona who summed it up in one sentence during a live interview. She did what the rest of us forgot how to. She acted before she asked who else was watching. By the next morning, the boy who had raised the pipe was in custody. Charged with aggravated assault and animal cruelty, he appeared in juvenile court with his head lowered, flanked by parents who seemed more confused than remorseful. His name spread online, his image shared across comment sections with the kind of fury that burns brighter than fire, and his school released a statement no one believed. The other two boys had fled town, and while no charges were yet filed against them, their names were already being whispered in the digital wind. But the attention didn't stay on punishment. It turned toward purpose. Within 72 hours, a nonprofit dedicated to retired military and service dogs announced a national campaign called Sophie's Bill, a proposed act that would extend federal protection to minors who intervene to protect government-trained animals in public incidents. The bill was picked up by a bipartisan committee within 5 days. More than 800,000 signatures poured in within a week. And somewhere in a quiet room in the back of the hospital, Hank Morrison sat beside Sophie, his hat resting on his knee, his fingers absent-mindedly stroking the badge pinned to Briggs' vest. "He's getting older," he said, mostly to himself. Sophie didn't reply. She just turned her head toward the window again and smiled as another dog, tail wagging and tongue lolling, took its place on the lawn, the handler at its side lifting a hand in greeting before kneeling to place another tag in the growing wooden box by the hospital gate. They were still coming. Not because they had to, but because she had. By the time fall arrived in Wesley Ridge, the trees lining Maplewood Avenue had turned the color of warm copper and smoldering gold, their leaves drifting lazily down onto sidewalks that no longer bore silence, but laughter. The hospital wing that had once been flooded with fear now echoed with steady footsteps and conversations about recovery, about resilience, about ribbons tied to leashes and the names of dogs etched into polished plaques. And in the center of it all, like a new chapter scrawled across a story that had once nearly ended too soon, stood Sophie Wallace, her hair pulled back into a loose braid that exposed the faint line of a scar along her right temple, the kind that would fade with time but never disappear completely. She didn't try to hide it. In fact, she seemed to wear it the way some children wore bracelets, like something earned, not regretted. 3 months had passed since that day on the sidewalk. She no longer needed assistance to walk, no longer winced when she raised her arms to hug someone. And when the town hosted its annual fall service parade that October, Sophie didn't just attend, she led it. Riding in the front cab of a vintage fire truck surrounded by handlers and dogs from every branch of service, her voice rose above the hum of applause as she waved to classmates and strangers alike. The sleeves of her custom Honor K9 Ambassador jacket rolled up just enough to show the charm bracelet dangling from her wrist. Each charm shaped like a different dog tag, each one engraved with the name of a dog that had come to stand outside her window during her recovery. Beside her sat Hank Morrison, posture straight, eyes glassy but unashamed, one hand resting on his cane, while the other gently patted the head of the German shepherd sitting between them. Briggs had slowed in the past few weeks, his steps a bit more deliberate, his naps a little longer. But there was no question he was still watching, still listening, still guarding the girl he had once nearly lost. He wore a vest that no longer marked him as active, but rather veteran, and beneath it a patch that simply read, "She saved me, too." The parade ended not with confetti or fireworks, but with a ceremony beside the hospital garden, where city officials, local veterans, and families from miles around gathered to witness the unveiling of the new K9 Memorial, designed in the shape of a child and a dog walking side by side, their figures cast in bronze but their expressions soft, their bodies turned toward the horizon. At the base of the statue, a plaque read, "She stood for him, so we stood for her," in honor of those who protect and those who believe they're worth protecting. Briggs passed away quietly 2 winters later. It happened overnight, without suffering, without fear, his head resting on the same old flannel Hank used to wrap around his leash during long walks, his body curled beside the fireplace where Sophie had read him stories every Saturday afternoon. He had lived a long life, a life of service, a life of noise and war and silence and healing, and in the end, he had been held not by a soldier, but by a child who had once called him brave long before anyone else did. They buried him beneath the flagpole outside the new Wesley Ridge Center for K-9 Therapy and Rescue, a facility built with donations raised in Sophie's name, co-founded by Hank and staffed by veterans, therapists, and volunteers who all agreed on one thing: dogs didn't just serve people, they saved them. Carved into the wood beam above the entrance were the same words that had once been written in permanent marker across Sophie's old notebook. "No one stands alone, not if we can help it." Years passed. Sophie grew. She became not just a trainer, but a mentor, working with children who struggled to speak, children whose minds raced too fast or not fast enough, and children who had been told too many times they didn't fit anywhere. She taught them patience. She taught them presence. And she taught them how to listen to a heartbeat that didn't come with words. On her desk sat an old photo, faded at the corners but still vibrant where it mattered. It was a shot of her, age 9, sitting on a hospital bed with a 1,000-yard stare and a dog's head in her lap. In the corner of the photo, barely visible behind the curtain, hung a garland of ID tags that would, in time, become the first artifact of a movement that outlived hashtags and headlines. Every year, on the anniversary of the march, the town gathered again. Not with speeches, not with television crews, but with dogs, and stories, and long walks through streets that once carried silence but now held the echoes of footsteps belonging to those who refused to look away when someone else stood up first. They came not because they had to, but because they remembered what she did, and what it made them believe again.